When investors ask me, like, Altana is the X of Y, the best one I've come to so far is we're actually the Bloomberg Terminal for the world supply chain. So one of the kind of beautiful things about the platform we've built is that every organization that connects to it improves the supply chain visibility and intelligence for all of the network participants. We've got an AI system that processes shipment data and cross-border customs data in real time, where we can now programmatically distinguish between safe and trustworthy and compliant trade and the opposite. We're working between and among governments and the private sector, and we're trying to connect everybody up into these shared views so that you can actually have policies that have a climate benefit, a security benefit, a resilience benefit, right?
Welcome to Political Capital, episode 8 on AI and trade, data, security, and supply chains in an era of global volatility. My name is Nate Lowenthal. I'm the founder and managing partner of Commonweal Ventures and the host of Political Capital. Political Capital is a conversation series exploring the intersection of technology, policy, and finance. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today from home and from work. Honored today to be joined by my friend, Evan Smith, the founder and CEO of Altana Technologies. Altana is the world's first value chain management system. It's an AI model of the global supply chain that helps governments, enterprises, and financial institutions to understand, monitor, and optimize trade. Evan, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Nate.
I'm going to turn it over to you in just a second to give us a little bit of background about Altana. But I wanted to share kind of two observations to frame the conversation. The first is that it strikes me that in this current political environment, it's noteworthy that virtually the only thing that Democrats and Republicans are able to agree on is the need for trade restrictions. And indeed, the two parties are out-competing each other, trying to be more bellicose on tariffs and what have you. And what's so striking me about that is not just that it's the only thing that they agree on, but that even 10 years ago, it would have been heresy to be out there talking about trade restrictions almost at all. And now you have President Biden on solar panels on, just last week talking about, new tariffs on electric vehicles from China. And it's this quite profound reversal of 70 years, give or take, of trade liberalization. And, trade is not just about, as you know better than anyone, about this or that widget. It's fundamentally about how countries think and engage with one another. And we're at this moment right now where we're slamming the doors on people's faces across the world, which it doesn't feel that good. And it suggests to me that we're at the beginning of a pretty profound change. And so I want to get into during our conversation, what this means for the future. So that's the first observation. And the second, and really the reason I wanted to chat with you guys with you today, is that Altana, while you guys are building a great software product, and doing all the other things that startups do, you also have a real view of the world. And you are, personally and as a business, very keyed into this shift right now. And that's reflected in your team. It's reflected in the manifesto that you guys published. It's reflected in the conversations and events that you guys host that I've been to. And it seems to me one of the reasons that your business has such potential is that you are helping your customers see this bigger picture and understand this shift that's happening today. And it's not just that you're working with manufacturers or what have you. You're working with the U.S. Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security, and not just in the U.S. With the UK and some other country, foreign governments around the world. So you're really right in the heart of this, this moment of change, which you guys talk about in terms of Globalization 2.0. And that, I think, is really exciting, and I'm sure it brings great benefits to your customers and also means you guys have a bright future. So with those two kind of framing comments, maybe start off by just telling us about Altana and the kind of the story of the company and what you guys are up to.
Well, thanks for having me. You and I have had a kind of ongoing conversation for years now about how some of the generational restructuring of politics, of global economics, of international relations are playing out. And Altana is really an expression of that worldview, where our point of view is that the most of the big generational dislocations in our professional lifetime are going to play out in the theater of the supply chain. Climate change, Cold War II, the rise of artificial intelligence, the role of work. These things are going to have their locus in the supply chain. And so at Altana, we've set out to build a model of that whole bottoms-up global supply chain network. And then what you do with that is we connect governments and the private sector across different stakeholders into this common operating picture, and then give them the tools to take command of global value chains. So what's a value chain? To be a little wonky, what we mean by that is that whole network from raw materials through the intermediate goods as they're kind of assembled together, then to the final assembly of a finished product like an iPhone, and then on down to the customer, right? And then it's that logistics and financing of that whole chain. So that's what we mean by a value chain. And what outsourcing did programmatically and deliberately for 75 years was really obscure away and abstract away all of these value chains. Right. So the whole point was you don't and you shouldn't control that whole value chain of production for your thing. Right. Everybody should operate according to their comparative advantage, and manufacturing and production should go to the locations on Earth where the labor costs and the environmental costs and manufacturing costs are most economically efficient. Right. And what that did was create this entirely interconnected but entirely opaque system of production. So what we do at Altana is we reveal that, and I can get into that and explain how, but we reveal that entire bottoms-up, living, breathing, multi-tier global network, and then we situate each of these constituents. You're a trader importing into the United States, you're a big global retailer and you need to understand your brands and like where all the cotton in the jeans come from. Or you're the Defense Department and you need to understand if there's a state actor deep in the magnets in the F-35. And so how do we kind of trace these networks and then take command of them? So that's the journey we're on, is don't just see the network. That's step one, but then you have to actually get into it and impose and manage rules-based, trusted global value chain networks.
And we'll get more into the kind of value chain management system that you guys are building. Yep. But some of the statistics that you've shared and that I've seen are really striking about just how little even quite sophisticated companies know about their supply chains. And so they might know who they buy their products from, although sometimes they don't, but they certainly don't know the people who their suppliers buying from, and in these global, for Apple, there's 10 rungs deep.
Yep.
And so, in a world of much more trade volatility and conflict, you actually need to know all 10 rungs. And that's sort of what you guys are trying to bring to the table.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like if you go into the business processes and then the software around them for a company, everything's designed around managing customers on one side of the business and suppliers on the other side of the business. And if you go into Salesforce or SAP or Oracle, they don't even have the concept of a tier 2 or a tier 3 relationship, right? So our software is a reflection of the way of doing work, right? Where it's just about, I have suppliers and I have customers, and that's my universe, and that's the dimension that I manage my business around. And so you're right. The world is changing in this fundamental way, which is creating the imperative and in a lot of cases the legal requirement to know and manage and be accountable for that entire chain of production and not just your little slice of the world.
Right. That's so interesting because it suggests it's like a conceptual education matter as a first step. It's not just a new software product. It's like you actually have to understand the fundamentals of your business in a different way in order to get this new category of risks.
Yeah, there's nobody in the business with the title value chain manager.
Right.
So the kinds of problems you're solving, whether it's understanding your entire global carbon footprint and what they call scope 3 carbon, where it's the carbon footprint upstream of you in the supply chain beyond your direct control, or whether it's these compliance and sanctions and forced labor kind of thou shalt government requirements coming down. Or after COVID hit, everyone's talking about resilience, and that too is a multi-tier. My supplier went down. The port of Shanghai is clogged up because whatever it is, and then what are the cascading impacts? So to act upon that information, by definition, you need to be working cross-functionally across, sustainability, compliance, procurement, sourcing, finance. Then you need to be working cross-functionally outside of your organization with these different stakeholders. So really, the answer to these kind of value chain problems is value chain management and like a collaborative system for connecting those stakeholders into a common operating picture and actually taking command of these dynamics.
And as we'll get into in a minute, I mean, the reason that's so important is because of this shift that, we were talking about in terms of much more, not just trade restrictions, but requirements about understanding, is this produced by forced labor in China? What is the carbon footprint of this product? Without that visibility, it's sort of impossible to know.
Totally.
It just for folks who may not be as familiar with the business, in terms of where you guys are progress-wise, you signed up some pretty significant customers. Where do things kind of stand today?
We're about 5.5 years in the journey, and just shy of 200 people, and we look much more like a SpaceX or Google Maps kind of journey than a enterprise app kind of journey. So deep R&D, connecting data across the public and private sectors, publicly available, purchasable data, scrapable data, with the very high value, sensitive data of some of the largest organizations in the world. So we built the whole business around this federated data and learning approach that allows us to render a common operating picture using AI from these sensitive data sets that you really can't pool in one place. So the answer to like, how do you build a Google Maps for the supply chain was, well, you have to meet the data where it is. There's no like universe where governments and insurance providers and banks and logistics providers are going to allow you to pool all their data. So that's what we built. And now, 5.5 years later, we have really just an incredibly like top tier client list of, some of the publicly nameable ones are, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the Department of Homeland Security. We work with the Department of Defense, the Department of Commerce, similar cast of characters in the UK and Australia. So civil agencies where you're looking to enforce laws, drive economic policy, that kind of thing. National security agencies, where you're looking to protect supply chains or sustain the supply chains of the defense industrial base. And then, in the private sector, we're working with, everybody from, Lloyd's of London and big insurance carriers, where you're having to model the entire global supply chain network and understand these business interruption risks that cascade across entire insurance portfolios. We're working with some of the biggest logistics providers in the world. I can name Maersk as one. And then it's, yeah, I think they have 20% of world shipping.
Yeah.
And then it's, big enterprises with global supply chains. So think everybody from a retailer to brands to manufacturers. And it's really, industry agnostic. Our platform kind of covers the whole world. And that keeps growing. And so one of the kind of beautiful things about the platform we've built is that every organization that connects to it improves the supply chain visibility and intelligence for all of the network participants, right? So you get this virtuous cycle of, more and more visibility, more and more intelligence on that network so that you can do more powerful things to actually take command of these big multi-tier, otherwise kind of totally opaque supply chain networks.
And you mentioned this kind of federated learning model. Maybe just a little bit more about that. How, obviously people are very sensitive about their data being shared. So how are you extracting the value without breaking those, relationships to be able to add value to the broader network?
So when we were starting the company and we didn't have a name for it yet, we were the whole summer just calling it CH Corp, where CH is the country code for Switzerland. And so like we need to build the data Switzerland, where you can neutrally act upon and connect to these different data sets without really violating them. So our answer to that is architectural, it's technical, it's legal. The non-wonky answer is what we do is we bring this map of the world, so it's data and AI. We bring a copy of it down to our customers' data in situ, so there's like a Maersk version of Altana. And we process their data in that environment, isolated. GDPR requires you to keep European data on your European soil, so that's satisfied in this model. And what we then glean from the data are three things. One is the network connections. So it's not all the deepest, darkest secrets of pricing and bills of materials, but we do understand, hey, this company at this location sells these goods to this company at this location.
And buys from this other location.
Exactly. So those network connections, just like in the Facebook social graph or like LinkedIn's business graph, we're building the graph of all the supply chain connections in the world, right? So that comes off the data. The second thing are sort of derived analytics. So we're building a picture of trustworthy, compliant, and the opposite, entities, traders, locations, products around the world. So those machine learning driven analytics, as you crunch all the data, those become part of the network. And then we train artificial intelligence models across that federated network. So just to bring that last bit to life, we've got an AI system that processes shipment data and cross-border customs data in real time. And the model's been able to learn from the seizures and the detentions and then the releases, like the good, valid shipments across many global jurisdictions and across many, different massive logistics providers and their trade networks, where we can now programmatically distinguish between safe and trustworthy and compliant trade and the opposite, right? So that sets you up for all kinds of really interesting use cases on trade facilitation, on helping the private sector to programmatically screen their own customers and their own shipments at the point of booking. And then, in some of the work we're starting to do now to actually connect the dots between the public and private sector and say, hey, can we create like a green lane for customs, right? So the result of all that federated learning is that you're building out this kind of common operating picture, the summary view of the network, and then an intelligence layer on top of that, which is fed by the underlying data, but that doesn't include the underlying data itself.
It's interesting, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but it's kind of like there's the Google Maps analogy, the LinkedIn or social media analogy, the Oracle analogy. You're trying to do something different. It's not one or the other of those. It's kind of like an atlas. It's kind of like a social network. It's kind of a new category of
when investors ask me like, what's the Altana is the X of
right,
Y.
the TurboTax of whatever. Right.
The best one I've come to so far is we're actually the Bloomberg Terminal for the world supply chain.
Right.
So what Bloomberg did was, they built this proprietary data asset and data network first. Then they built a collaborative communication and execution layer on top of that connects all the traders and participants in the network. And then they eventually open that up as a platform ecosystem that other people can hook into and build on, connect exchanges to. So that's probably the cleanest analogy for the journey we're on.
Yeah. And that's what you call this value chain management system.
That's right.
Overall. And you guys sort of announced this new version of the product just a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
Got it. So let's talk for a second about why this matters so much now. And you guys wrote, I thought, quite thoughtful manifesto a couple of years ago that laid out, kind of the political economy of the moment. What is shifting in a deep way, where trade is not just about who buys what from whom, but about how countries engage with one another on the global stage. So, what is your concept of globalization 2.0? What is shifting and why is that creating this new demand for the kind of product you guys are building?
So before going there, let's like organize the kind of core ideology and structure of globalization 1.0, like what we did over the last 75 years, and then contrast it. So, post Bretton Woods, I don't know how wonky you guys want to get.
Go deep. Go deep. This show is called Political Capital, so we're all.
We following the end of World War II, we engaged in these big agreements, which set the liberal, capital L, not like democratic, but capital L liberal frameworks for the political economy in the West, right? So there's the communist framework, and then there was the sort of Bretton Woods framework, or they eventually called it the Washington Consensus. And the kind of core tenets of that were nations should move toward increasingly free trade between themselves. So tariffs were inherently a bad thing in that they prevented specialization and comparative advantage, and the economic interdependency that would arise from that kind of free trade, where the theory was that economic interdependence was going to be a driver of peace.
Right.
So we're in this, bipolar moment where there's a U.S. security umbrella around this whole global trade system, ex-Soviet, right? And we said, we're going to use our consumer demand, so our purchasing power. We're gonna reduce tariffs at our border so that you can trade with us restriction free, and we're gonna, cajole and incentivize and motivate everybody else to do the same. But effectively, like, the United States economy is going to be the source of demand for the rest of the world that's kind of coming out of World War II, and that we're going to do this in a free trade context, and create this, web of interdependence under a U.S. security umbrella. So like that's what got the whole thing going.
And that's like Montesquieu called it "do commerce," sweet commerce, bring people together, or more, countries and McDonald's don't go to war with each other. That was like the underlying political philosophy.
Yeah,
everyone trades with the U.S. and we're all interdependent, and like rah rah, no conflict possible.
Exactly. Tom Friedman called it the golden arches theory of, So that was a theory. And then, the other kind of big thing that happened along the way was we broke the gold standard. Nixon did, and we just went to a pure fiat currency, dollar-denominated global trading system. And
just explain that. I mean, literally, people trade in dollars. They convert their currency in dollars, and they keep everything in dollars, and that's how trade really flows.
Right. The dollar's the medium of exchange on these international cross-border settlements. So those two things primarily, and then I think, everybody got an MBA, and like the kind of management orthodoxy was around outsourcing. So if you've got free trade and you have this multi-decade state of peace, and the whole world's going to move toward one big interdependent, happy, generally peaceful place where
all the eating family,
and we can all, produce the things where it's most economically efficient to do so. Then obviously the choice is you're going to outsource your value chains of your manufacturing, and let the market find the most economically efficient place to do that. So that's what happened over the last 75 years. You've got a highly interdependent, interconnected trading system. You've got a trading system that remains dollar denominated. It's, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's in this, high 60% of global trade is settled in dollars. And then reserves, are even higher as a percentage of Forex reserves. And then, the private sector went and just outsourced like crazy. And now you've got these like massively complex global value chain networks that, for the beginning of the conversation, nobody really can see into. Okay, so that's where we were, and where we got.
That's 1.0 globalization.
That's 1.0. So then what went wrong, and then why is there something new? So I describe it as the side effects and unintended consequences of that globalization. The biggest thing by far was China, right? 2000, 2001, we admitted China into the WTO. And the result then was this incredibly fast, rapid industrialization of China and their export capacity, and the kind of corresponding deindustrialization in the West. And there's some hand-wringing about it from mostly political and kind of social impact standpoint, but on the right and left, the theory was pretty uniform, where it's just, this is a good thing because free trade and capitalism beget free trade and capitalism, which then beget democracy. So that was kind of the entire framework, end of history. And then you had a strategic competitor that didn't cooperate.
Not interested in this particular theory.
Yeah, no, they weren't buying it. So they very strategically and systematically abused that system to gain advantage in these supply chain networks and advantage, their manufacturing base in particular, but increasingly seeking total command of choke points in the world's value chains. They've succeeded in critical minerals, for example.
Rare earths.
So anyway, that's thing one, is like China didn't cooperate. And the result then is 25 years later, we're in a state where our defense industrial base, our pharmaceuticals, our renewable energy capacity, our advanced electronics, our modern information technology-based economy,
the most vital systems on which we depend,
literally, all have this fundamental and irreversible, I shouldn't say irreversible, but it's going to be hard,
entrenched,
very entrenched dependence on China. And that wouldn't matter so much, except that Thucydides' trap, take your whatever spin you want to take on it, but we're now clearly in Cold War II.
Yeah.
And so the world is kind of breaking down along these geopolitical fault lines, and then of course that pops up in the supply chain. So that's thing one. Thing two is all of these environmental and social externalities. So like, I know you know what externality is, but just for the benefit of this conversation, so it's an unpriced cost of some economic output, right? So like the market can put in dollars and cents, the input costs, the labor costs, the manufacturing costs, but what about the carbon emissions and the environmental pollution and the labor impacts in the context of child labor or forced labor? So those are called externalities, where the market's not actually capturing the true embedded cost of that way of doing business. So, I think we've just very, very clearly entered the scary version of some of the climate change models from the 90s. This has been kind of a slow boiling system, but we're now in the.
I was just boiling. Yeah.
It's just boiling, right? So like, Florida homes are uninsurable. California homes are uninsurable. There's hundreds of billions of dollars of climate related losses every year in insurance. The Panama Canal has dried out several times in the last couple of years. The reason it's these sort of estuaries, these lakes that are feeding the canal, and if those go dry, then like you literally can't move trade.
It's the global trade, yeah.
Yeah, so that's going to get worse, not better. And then the world is really reckoning with some of the labor rights issues in these upstream supply chains, and that's starting to manifest in policy that's actually driving this big refactoring. So that's thing two, is these like environmental and social externalities have come home to roost. I think the third thing is that I can draw a pretty straight line between the rise of populism and the deindustrialization and the hollowing out of the industrial middle class in the West.
Yeah. That's interesting, because I was thinking about this morning, the trends in the US about trade restrictions and whatnot are not confined to the US. And indeed, like, I think arguably reflect a much deeper trend globally, where you and I are not the only ones who are concerned about this. A large chunk of the world's population feels that something they can't quite put their finger on is amiss. And these reactions around trade restrictions are part and parcel of that.
Totally. Yeah, like there's a malaise, right? And they know that the system isn't working for them, and it's kind of like easy to find scapegoats,
Yeah.
but my version of that diagnosis is that um, between financialization, which I attached to that decision to break the gold standard, run up a massive, massive, massive uh, debt burden, public sector debt burden, even private sector debt burden, where you can just print money. We've grown debt levels at a rate 5 times greater than we've grown GDP since we broke the gold standard in the early 1970s. So, like, who does that benefit? It benefits those with financial assets, because all that inflation is going into stocks, bonds, land, companies.
Correlated with a sharp rise in inequality.
Yeah, so this huge explosion of wealth inequality and the sort of simultaneous, think about it as like on an inflation adjusted basis, I think it's like 90% of Americans haven't had a wage increase since the 70s. So, globalization is driving down labor costs, the cost of goods and services. You've now got an internationally competitive market. You have, inflation in the real economy eroding purchasing power. You have that inflationary stimulus of all this debt creation going into financial assets, which benefit the rich. So basically, the picture is that for 40 years or so, you've had most people not getting a pay raise when adjusted for inflation.
Yeah.
In the U.S. and across much, but not all of the West, broadly defined, and then those, at the very top with financial assets benefiting in this like extraordinary way over the same time period. So those things, converge here in this context where it's like deindustrialization, flat wages, a huge explosion in wealth inequality, and now we're in a place where you've got authoritarianism and populism everywhere, right?
Right.
People are crying out in pain.
And so globalization 2.0 then, like, how is this being reflected in the sort of shifting trade policies, and what sorts of new challenges is that creating for governments and for the private sector that has to, follow the new rules?
So the IMF came out with a study a month or two ago that showed that in the last year alone, there have been 1,200 net new economic security policies.
Globally.
Globally, yeah. So like, what do we mean by economic security? There's no like textbook definition for this, and actually, I'll give you my own version of it. But this decomposes into trade restrictions, import and export controls, things you would traditionally conceive of as industrial policy, like the CHIPS Act. I want to subsidize and really favor the production of an industry.
Put our finger on the scale.
I want to put my finger on the scale as the government. And so those are all kind of under the umbrella now of this broader policy conversation of economic security, right? So Globalization 1.0 created an economically insecure state of affairs. Now the kind of big thinking is we need economic security. So you've had this, hockey stick in government policy toward economic security, and it's dressed up usually in 3 or 4 dimensions. So one is resilience, one is ESG, environmental, social impact kind of thing, and another is around industrial policy and kind of like national security around industrial policy. So I can go through a laundry list. I think a couple of them are actually worth just lingering on. So there's a bill that went into effect, or a policy that went into effect and has been enforced over the last 18 months that's really changing the game. It's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this is concerned with the ethnically Muslim Uyghur population in Western China in a province called Xinjiang. And so what this bill does in the United States is it creates a rebuttable presumption where anybody importing into the United States has to prove dispositively that their goods don't contain an upstream connection to Xinjiang, or else they risk detention.
Right.
And the enforcement of it is, when it came out, everyone's like, they're not going to really enforce this, but it's been real, billions of dollars of goods detained and seized, and some of the biggest brands and manufacturers in the world. So it's creating this, shock the system moment where the private sector is saying, crap, I have to actually go figure out what my tier 4, 5, 6 connections are in my jeans or my shirt. Where does the cotton actually come from, and where's the spinning mill,
Because
and
this
is
is
that in
not,
Xinjiang?
it's actually like, I think you guys believe around 10% of all products globally actually have some input from this region. So it's not some niche problem. It's
No,
like,
it infects like everything.
yeah,
It's like cotton, aluminum, pharmaceuticals, base chemicals. It's a bunch of the food supply chain. So Xinjiang is one of the major manufacturing and agricultural regions of China, which supplies the entire world, right? And these like global brands generally mean well and are trying to do the right thing. They're not buying directly from this place.
right,
The issue is it's deep, 6, 7, 8 tiers away beyond their visibility or control.
right.
So that was sort of a policy harbinger, I'd say. And you're seeing a bunch of others kind of flow from that. So in the EU, there was a big policy. I'm erring on the side of being wonky because it's you, and there's
Yeah,
a
it's
lot.
good.
So the EU Green Deal was a big kind of policy framework that everybody aligned on in 2018, and there's been a number of individual bills that have made their way from the Commission to Parliament into effect. And some of those have just started to hit. Some of them are going to actually, take effect and be enforced over the next couple of years. What they do across each of them is require the private sector to know and screen and report on their entire value chains. Right. So there's the carbon border adjustment. This is pretty wild. So it's a carbon tariff at the border affecting 6 commodity categories that are in like everything. So steel, aluminum, you get the idea. Um, so the EU has said we're going to level the playing field between polluting countries who have cheaper goods, i.e. China,
Right.
and domestic manufacturers, or overseas manufacturers who have cleaner but more expensive goods. And we're going to use a carbon tariff, or what they call a carbon border adjustment, to level the playing field. The U.S. is considering its own version of this. To your point earlier, this is the only thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on.
Right.
Is we need to gain economic security, and we need to counteract China in this supply chain competition.
Yeah. It's striking to me, one thing you said that people frame why they're doing this in different ways, and maybe genuinely, it's about supply chain resilience. We can't deal with another COVID disruption, or it's about climate, or it's about national security, but like fundamentally, they all result in quite similar sets of rules applied to different parts of the economy. And that suggests to me this is like the Uyghur thing is sort of in one way specific, but your point is it's manifesting a much deeper trend that's likely to continue to accelerate.
It's all of a piece. Yeah, I
Yeah.
can keep going down the list, but it's these major policy drivers, and it's not just policy with respect to private sector and compliance and enforcement. It's also policy between governments. So
Right.
the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, that is colloquially called the Supply Chain Agreement. So it's the U.S. and the kind of Indo-Pacific
Right.
trading partners all agreeing to build resilient supply chains. So the whole thing's under the sort of umbrella of resilience post-COVID, but the very plain motivating factor underneath it is economic security and the ability to, in some cases, build redundancy from China, and in
Right.
other cases, build a bit of offensive capability,
Yeah.
right?
And I mean, so China is obviously one key driver, but it's not the only one. Climate is also in there.
China, climate, and then COVID was a real thing, right? So what we all learned was that these outsourced just-in-time networks are only efficient when things are stable.
Right.
And then when it's not, you get these incredibly dislocating, multi-trillion-dollar impacts that kind of wipe out all those gains. So, resiliency is a big thing, but it's getting situated from a policy standpoint in this economic security framework.
And so fundamentally, the value chain management system that you guys are building is enabling companies to navigate this new political, economic, and kind of international relations reality where they, both for good economic reasons apart from politics and for very good political reasons,
Yep.
really need to understand those 10 rungs of supplies. Where is this really coming from? Is there a plantation where they're cutting down trees in Indonesia? Is there a Uyghur, forced labor in it? And also just how can we maybe cut out one chain of dependency, or how can we streamline it so we're slightly more resilient? And those are the questions you're helping answer.
Yeah. So this is it's literally a new way of doing business, and then it's a new toolkit to enable this new way of doing business. And a lot of this has to do with mandatory, government imposed new ways of working. But there's, I think, a lot of upside too. So the way that we talk about it is around virtual vertical integration.
Yeah.
So back to the concept of we went from a world in the 1800s and early 1900s of incredibly centralized manufacturing. Ford Motors in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, actually well into the 20th century, they owned their own rubber plantations to make tires. Right. So that's what I mean by vertical integration. And then we outsourced and we said, why should Ford own that? We just want to do the final assembly. And now Ford has, tens of thousands of suppliers directly, and those have tens more and so on. So I think the paradigm that's possible here in a world where, all these parties can actually tap into a common operating picture and see these things, at least enough of the network and the insight on it to operate on these dimensions. And then they can actually connect and collaborate and do work through that network. Then it starts to look something like virtual vertical integration. And you can better coordinate supply and demand through trusted value chains. You can impose carbon or climate or labor or other kind of rules over these value chain networks, and then monitor it and then weed it out, right? Verify it. So it starts, it's sort of the rules-based order that we were all excited about from Bretton Woods.
Right.
But within the context of these, visible and networked and collaborative value chains.
Trusted networks, you call them.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they'll be in some ways driven by the large end producer. So it'll be Apple or Ford or whatever that creates sort of their trusted network, where they have visibility and their suppliers have, are sort of in communication with each other more directly.
The Department of Defense in the United States, AUKUS is a really interesting example where, we've said explicitly in Pillar 2 of AUKUS that we're going to have this supply chain collaboration.
AUKUS?
AUKUS, A-U-K-U-S. So this was a tri-party agreement between the U.S., Australia, and the United Kingdom under the Biden administration, where we've created a security collaboration. So the headline was nuclear submarines, but the totality of AUKUS is really about having a supply chain and logistics and weapons system collaboration. So in the Indo-Pacific,
right,
among those three parties. And so, we're going to share these big, sensitive, export-controlled weapons platforms like the nuclear submarines, but we're also going to have supply chain transparency and collaboration among those AUKUS partners, right, in the defense industrial base, and then there's going to be a logistics cooperation as well. So that's just all to say that this concept of trusted networks, trusted value chains, is about more than, Fortune 500 companies complying with the law. This is about
Governments are adopting similar models.
Governments are adopting similar models. NATO is going to end up with some version of this, right? Like, after Russia invaded and we couldn't produce Stingers and Javelins or even 155 shells, it's like, okay, well, we actually need to reindustrialize and work together. So like, there's going to be a trusted network, trusted value chain version for the defense industrial base in NATO. Like that's where this is all going.
So, and let's wrap up on that topic, and just sort of one more question. The core thesis for Commonweal as a firm is that if you're building products that matter for America, partnership with government can be a really critical unlock, and indeed might be the most vital unlock. And you guys are an interesting example where it is very much like, whether you personally think these policies are good or not is not really the question. They are happening, and there's a deep well that's driving it. This is just the reality we live in. And you guys are working in this interesting way across public and private sector, helping governments solve these problems, helping the private sector solve problems, and also helping them kind of coordinate. You talk about, shared oversight of supply chains.
Yep.
So maybe just some reflections on kind of how, does that thesis resound with you guys, and, how have you been able to engage successfully with governments to build this?
Yeah, let's set aside whether it's righteous and correct, and and just focus on what is, because the orthodoxy for decades was government should stay out of the private sector, right? I personally don't think that's totally true, and me, I'm a weird mix of pretty strong libertarian bent and a pretty strong socialist bent on some issues. So there's a very strong role for government in my worldview, but let's set worldviews aside and just say what's happening and where's this all going. It's very, very clear to me that governments are going to play a much deeper role in the economy, in the supply chain, in global trade networks, and just generally in the private sector state of affairs. I mean, look at where the AI conversation is going. And so if you're a leader of a business in the private sector and you're not orienting your business to succeed in that paradigm, good luck.
Yeah. Especially if you do anything across borders. Yeah.
Well, and in our case, we're building a business to enable that, not just to surf the trend, but to effectuate it, right? So we're working between and among governments and the private sector, and we're trying to connect everybody up into these shared views and this shared kind of network and toolkit, so that you can actually have policies that have a climate benefit, a security benefit, a resilience benefit, right?
This partnership with Customs and Borders Protection is a great example where you're trying to work with them. Like, ultimately, they do want good trade to happen. They're not against Americans buying stuff and selling stuff abroad. It just needs to follow the rules. And so how do you enable this kind of green light process so that the folks who are doing the right thing and following the rules, don't have to wait 3 weeks to get everything inspected, or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, Customs has an explicit dual mandate. It's kind of like the Fed. So they have two missions. One is to enforce trade law, and trade and traveler law, right? And the other is to facilitate.
Right.
Right. So, and historically, those things have been understood in conflict with each other, right? And then, for a long time, it was like, if you want more security, if you want more enforcement, it's going to come at the expense of plugging up the airport or plugging up the customs line at the border. And then, it was, okay, maybe we can do risk targeting and pick needles out of the haystack, and that's how you kind of that's kind of how you have your cake and eat it too. And the conversation we're now having is with AI, with data, with the scale of technology that we have today, you can actually qualify the whole damn haystack.
Yeah.
So let's actually, the best analogy is, trusted traveler programs, clear when you go through the airport. So that's a voluntary construct where, if you want to go through the airport faster, you can share more data about yourself with this system that facilitates your movement across. And I think we're in a really unique position to do the same thing with trade and with cargoes.
Yeah. Well, Evan, it's awesome what you guys are building, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the analysis you've shared. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk again soon.
Thank you for having me. It's fun.
All right, thank you, Jim. Bye.
Good night.